A distant episode. By Paul Bowles. The September sunsets were at their reddest the week the professor decided to visit Unsettled, which is in the warm country. He came down out of the high, flat region in the evening by bus, with 2 small overnight bags full of maps, sun lotions, and medicines. 10 years ago he had been in the village for 3 days, long enough, however, to establish a fairly firm friendship with a cafe keeper, who had written him several times during the first year after his visit, if never since. Hassan Rahmani, the professor said over and over, as the bus bumped downward through ever warmer layers of air. Now facing the flaming sky in the west, and now facing the sharp mountains, the car followed the dusty trail down the canyons into air which began to smell of other things besides the endless ozone of the heights, orange blossoms, pepper, sun-baked excrement, burning olive oil, rotten fruit. He closed his eyes happily and lived for an instant in a purely olfactory world. The distant past returned, what part of it, he could not decide. The chauffeur, whose seat the professor shared, spoke to him without taking his eyes from the road. Vous êtes géologue? A geologist? No. I'm a linguist. There are no languages here. Only dialects. Exactly. I'm making a survey of variations on Moghreby. The chauffeur was scornful. Keep on going south, he said. You'll find some languages you never heard of before. As they drove through the town gate, the usual swarm of urchins rose up out of the dust and ran screaming beside the bus. The professor folded his dark glasses, put them in his pocket, and as soon as the vehicle had come to a standstill he jumped out, pushing his way through the indignant boys who clutched at his luggage in vain, and walked quickly into the Grand Hotel Saharian. Out of its 8 rooms there were 2 available, one facing the market and the other, a smaller and cheaper one, giving onto a tiny yard full of refuse and barrels, where 2 gazelles wandered about. He took the smaller room, and pouring the entire pitcher of water into the tin basin, began to wash the grit from his face and ears. The afterglow was nearly gone from the sky, and the pinkness in objects was disappearing, almost as he watched. He lit the carbide lamp and winced at its odor. After dinner the professor walked slowly through the streets to Hassan Rahmani's cafe, whose back room hung hazardously out above the river. The entrance was very low, and he had to bend down slightly to get in. A man was tending the fire. There was one guest sipping tea. The Kawaji tried to make him take a seat at the other table in the front room, but the professor walked airily ahead into the back room and sat down. The moon shining through the reed latticework and there was not a sound outside but the occasional distant bark of a dog. He changed tables so he could see the river. It was dry, but there was a pool here and there that reflected the bright night sky. The Kawaji came in and wiped off the table. Does this cafe still belong to Hassan Rahmani? He asked him in the Moghreby he had taken 4 years to learn. The man replied in bad French, he is deceased. Deceased, repeated the professor, without noticing the absurdity of the word. Really? When? I don't know, said the Kawaji. 1 tea? Yes. But I don't understand. The man was already out of the room, fanning the fire. The professor sit still, feeling lonely, and arguing with himself that to do so was ridiculous. Soon the Kawaji returned with the tea. He paid him and gave him an enormous tip, for which he received a grave bow. Tell me, he said, as the other started away. Can one still get those little boxes made from camel udders? The man looked angry. Sometimes the Regwabat bring in those things. We do not buy them here. Then insolently, in Arabic, and why a camel udder box? Because I like them, retorted the professor. And then because he was feeling a little exalted, he added, I like them so much I want to make a collection of them, and I will pay you 10 francs for every one you can get me. Camstash, said the Kawaji, opening his left hand rapidly 3 times in succession. Never. 10. Not possible. But wait until later and come with me. You can give me what you like. And you will get camelotter boxes if there are any. He went out into the front room, leaving the professor to drink his tea and listen to the growing chorus of dogs that barked and howled as the moon rose higher into the sky. A group of customers came into the front room and sat talking for an hour or so. When they had left, the Kawaji put out the fire and stood in the doorway putting on his burnous. Come, he said. Outside in the street there was very little movement. The booths were all closed and the only light came from the moon. An occasional pedestrian passed, and grunted brief greeting to the Kawaji. Everyone knows you, said the professor, to cut the silence between them. Yes. I wish everyone knew me, said the professor, before he realized how infantile such a remark must sound. No one knows you, said his companion gruffly. They had come to the other side of the town, on the promontory above the desert, and through a great rift in the wall the professor saw the white endlessness, broken in the foreground by dark spots of oasis. They walked through the opening and followed a winding road between rocks, downward toward the nearest small forest of palms. The professor thought, he may cut my throat. But his cafe, he would surely be found out. Is it far? He asked, casually. Are you tired? Countered the Kawaji. They are expecting me back at the Hotel Saharian, he lied. You can't be there and here, said the Kawaji. The professor laughed. He wondered if it sounded uneasy to the other. Have you owned Ramani's cafe long? I work there for a friend. The reply made the professor more unhappy than he had imagined it would. Oh. Will you work tomorrow? That is impossible to say. The professor stumbled on a stone, and fell, scraping his hand. The Kawaji said, Be careful. The sweet black odor of rotten meat hung in the air suddenly. Ack, said the professor, choking. What is it? The Kawaji had covered his face with his burnous and did not answer. Soon the stench had been left behind. They were on flat ground. Ahead the path was bordered on each side by a high mud wall. There was no breeze and the palms were quite still, but behind the walls was the sound of running water. Also, the odor of human excrement was almost constant as they walked between the walls. The professor waited until he thought it seemed logical for him to ask with a certain degree of annoyance, But where are we going? Soon, said the guide, pausing to gather some stones in the ditch. Pick up some stones, he advised. Here are bad dogs. Where? Asked the professor, but he stooped and got 3 large ones with pointed edges. They continued very quietly. The walls came to an end and the bright desert lay ahead. Nearby was a ruined marabou, with its tiny dome only half standing, and the front wall entirely destroyed. Behind it were clumps of stunted, useless palms. A dog came running crazily toward them on 3 legs. Not until it got quite close did the professor hear its steady low growl. The Kawaji let fly a large stone at it, striking it square in the muzzle. There was a strange snapping of jaws and the dog ran sideways in another direction, falling blindly against rocks and scrambling haphazardly about like an injured insect. Turning off the road, they walked across the earth strewn with sharp stones, past the little ruin, through the trees, until they came to a place where the ground dropped abruptly away in front of them. It looks like a quarry, said the professor, resorting to French for the word quarry, whose Arabic equivalent he could not call to mind at the moment. The Kawaji did not answer. Instead he stood still and turned his head, as if listening. And indeed, from somewhere down below, but very far below, came the faint sound of a low flute. The Kawaji nodded his head slowly. Several said, "The path begins here. You can see it well all the way. The rock is white and the moon is strong. So you can see well. I am going back now and sleep. It is late. You can give me what you like. Standing there at the edge of the abyss, which at each moment looked deeper, with the dark face of the Kawaji framed in its moonlit burnous close to his own face, the professor asked himself exactly what he felt. Indignation, curiosity, fear, perhaps, but most of all relief and the hope that this was not a trick, the hope that the Kawaji would really leave him alone and turn back without him. He stepped back a little from the edge, and fumbled in his pocket for a loose note, because he did not want to show his wallet. Fortunately there was a 50-franc bill there, which he took out and handed to the man. He knew the Kawaji was pleased, and so he paid no attention when he heard him saying, "It is not enough. I have to walk a long way home and there are dogs." "Thank you and good night," said the professor, sitting down with his legs drawn up under him, and lighting a cigarette. He felt almost happy. "Give me only one cigarette," pleaded the man. "Of course," he said, a bit curtly, and he held up the pack. The Kawaji squatted close beside him. His face was not pleasant to see. "What is it?" thought the professor, terrified again, as he held out his lighted cigarette toward him. The man's eyes were almost closed. It was the most obvious registering of concentrated scheming the professor had ever seen. When the second cigarette was burning, he ventured to say to the still squatting Arab, "What are you thinking about?" The other drew on his cigarette deliberately, and seemed about to speak. Then his expression changed to one of satisfaction, but he did not speak. A cool wind had risen in the air, and the professor shivered. The sound of the flute came up from the depths below at intervals, sometimes mingled with the scraping of nearby palm fronds one against the other. "These people are not primitives," the professor found himself saying in his mind. "Good," said the Kawaji, rising slowly. "Keep your money. 50 francs is enough. It is an honor." Then he went back into French, "Tu es tu descendra, tout droit." He spat, chuckled, or was the professor hysterical, and strode away quickly. The professor was in a state of nerves. He lit another cigarette, and found his lips moving automatically. They were saying, "Is this a situation or a predicament? This is ridiculous." He sat very still for several minutes, waiting for a sense of reality to come to him. He stretched out on the hard, cold ground and looked up at the moon. It was almost like looking straight at the sun. If he shifted his gaze a little at a time, he could make a string of weaker moons across the sky. "Incredible," he whispered. Then he sat up quickly and looked about. There was no guarantee that the Kawaji really had gone back to town. He got to his feet and looked over the edge of the precipice. In the moonlight the bottom seemed miles away. And there was nothing to give it scale, not a tree, not a house, not a person. He listened for the flute, and heard only the wind going by his ears. A sudden violent desire to run back to the road seized him, and he turned and looked in the direction the Kawaji had taken. At the same time he felt softly of his wallet in his breast pocket. Then he spat over the edge of the cliff. Then he made water over it, and listened intently, like a child. This gave him the impetus to start down the path into the abyss. Curiously enough, he was not dizzy. But prudently he kept from peering to his right, over the edge. It was a steady and steep downward climb. The monotony of it put him into a frame of mind not unlike that which had been induced by the bus ride. He was murmuring Hassan Rahmani again, repeatedly, and in rhythm. He stopped, furious with himself for the sinister overtones the name now suggested to him. He decided he was exhausted from the trip. And the walk, he added. He was now well down the gigantic cliff, but the moon, being directly overhead, gave as much light as ever. Only the wind was left behind, above, to wander among the trees, to blow through the dusty streets of Eintedurt, into the hall of the Grand Hotel Saharian, and under the door of his little room. It occurred to him that he ought to ask himself why he was doing this irrational thing, but he was intelligent enough to know that since he was doing it, it was not so important to probe for explanations at that moment. Suddenly the earth was flat beneath his feet. He had reached the bottom sooner than he expected. He stepped ahead distrustfully still, as if he expected another treacherous drop. It was so hard to know in this uniform, dim brightness. Before he knew what had happened, the dog was upon him, a heavy mass of fur trying to push him backwards, a sharp nail rubbing down his chest, a straining of muscles against him to get the teeth into his neck. The professor thought, "I refuse to die this way." The dog fell back. It looked like an Eskimo dog. As it sprang again, he called out, very loud, "I." It fell against him. There was a confusion of sensations and a pain somewhere. There was also the sound of voices very near to him, and he could not understand what they were saying. Something cold and metallic was pushed brutally against his spine as the dog still hung for a second by his teeth from a mass of clothing and perhaps flesh. The professor knew it was a gun, and he raised his hands, shouting in Mograbi, "Take away the dog." But the gun merely pushed him forward, and since the dog, once it was back on the ground, did not leap again, he took a step ahead. The gun kept pushing, he kept taking steps. Again he heard voices, but the person directly behind him said nothing. People seemed to be running about, it sounded that way, at least. For his eyes, he discovered, were still shut tight against the dog's attack. He opened them. A group of men was advancing toward him. They were dressed in the black clothes of the Reguebat. The Regiba is a cloud across the face of the sun. When the Regiba appears, the righteous man turns away. In how many shops and marketplaces he had heard these maxims uttered banteringly among friends. Never to a Regiba, to be sure, for these men do not frequent towns. They send a representative in disguise, to arrange with shady elements there for the disposal of captured goods. An opportunity, he thought quickly, of testing the accuracy of such statements. He did not doubt for a moment that the adventure would prove to be a kind of warning against such foolishness on his part, a warning which in retrospect would be sinister, half farcical. 2 snarling dogs came running from behind the oncoming men and threw themselves at his legs. He was scandalized to note that no one paid any attention to this breach of etiquette. The gun pushed him harder as he tried to sidestep the animal's noisy assault. Again he cried, "The dogs! Take them away!" The gun shoved him forward with great force and he fell, almost at the feet of the crowd of men facing him. The dogs were wrenching at his hands and arms. A boot kicked them aside, yelping, and then with increased vigor it kicked the professor in the hip. Then came a chorus of kicks from different sides, and he was rolled violently about on the earth for a while. During this time he was conscious of hands reaching into his pockets and removing everything from them. He tried to say, "You have all my money, stop kicking me." But his bruised facial muscles would not work, he felt himself pouting, and that was all. Someone dealt him a terrific blow on the head, and he thought, "Now at least I shall lose consciousness, thank heaven." Still he went on being aware of the guttural voices he could not understand, and of being bound tightly about the ankles and chest. Then there was black silence that opened like a wound from time to time, to let in the soft, deep notes of the flute playing the same succession of notes again and again. Suddenly he felt excruciating pain everywhere, pain and cold. So I have been unconscious, after all, he thought. In spite of that, the present seemed only like a direct continuation of what had gone before. It was growing faintly light. There were camels near where he was lying, he could hear their gurgling and their heavy breathing. He could not bring himself to attempt opening his eyes, just in case it should turn out to be impossible. However, when he heard someone approaching, he found that he had no difficulty in seeing. The man looked at him dispassionately in the gray morning light. With one hand he pinched together the professor's nostrils. When the professor opened his mouth to breathe, the man swiftly seized his tongue and pulled on it with all his might. The professor was gagging and catching his breath. He did not see what was happening. He could not distinguish the pain of the brutal yanking from that of the sharp knife. Then there was an endless choking and spitting that went on automatically, as though he were scarcely a part of it. The word "operation" kept going throughout his mind. It calmed his terror somewhat as he sank back into darkness. The caravan left sometime toward mid-morning. The professor, not unconscious, but in a state of utter stupor, still gagging and drooling blood, was dumped doubled up into a sack and tied at one side of a camel. The lower end of the enormous amphitheater contained a natural gate in the rocks. The camels, swift Mihara, were lightly laden on this trip. They passed through single file, and slowly mounted the gentle slope that led up into the beginning of the desert. That night, at a stop behind some low hills, the men took him out, still in a state which permitted no thought, and over the dust rags that remained of his clothing they fastened a series of curious belts made of the bottoms of tin cans strung together. One after another of these bright girdles was wired about his torso, his arms and legs, even across his face, until he was entirely within a suit of armor that covered him with its circular metal scales. There was a good deal of merriment during this decking out of the professor. One man brought out a flute and a younger one did a not ungraceful caricature of an owled nail executing a cane dance. The professor was no longer conscious. To be exact, he existed in the middle of the movements made by these other men. When they had finished dressing him the way they wished him to look, they stuffed some food under the tin bangles hanging over his face. Even though he chewed mechanically, most of it eventually fell out onto the ground. They put him back into the sack and left him there. 2 days later they arrived at one of their own encampments. There were women and children here in the tents, and the men had to drive away the snarling dogs they had left there to guard them. When they emptied the professor out of his sack, there were screams of fright, and it took several hours to convince the last woman that he was harmless, although there had been no doubt from the start that he was a valuable possession. After a few days they began to move on again, taking everything with them, and traveling only at night as the terrain grew warmer. Even when all his wounds had healed and he felt no more pain, the professor did not begin to think again. He ate and defecated, and he danced when he was bidden, a senseless hopping up and down that delighted the children, principally because of the wonderful jangling racket it made. And he generally slept through the heat of the day, in among the camels. Wending its way southeast, the caravan avoided all stationary civilization. In a few weeks they reached a new plateau, wholly wild and with a sparse vegetation. Here they pitched camp and remained, while the Mebarah were turned loose to graze. Everyone was happy here, the weather was cooler and there was a well only a few hours away on a seldom frequented trail. It was here they conceived the idea of taking the professor to Foggara and selling him to the Tuareg. It was a full year before they carried out this project. By this time the professor was much better trained. He could do a handspring, make a series of fearful growling noises which had, nevertheless, a certain element of humor, and when the Regwabat removed the tin from his face they discovered he could grimace admirably while he danced. They also taught him a few basic obscene gestures which never failed to elicit delighted shrieks from the women. He was now brought forth only after especially abundant meals, when there was music and festivity. He easily fell in with their sense of ritual, and evolved an elementary sort of a program to present when he was called for, dancing, rolling on the ground, imitating certain animals, and finally rushing toward the group in feigned anger, to see the resultant confusion and hilarity. When 3 of the men set out for Foggara with him, they took 4 Mihara with them, and he rode astride his quite naturally. No precautions were taken to guard him, save that he was kept among them, one man always staying at the rear of the party. They came within sight of the walls at dawn, and they waited among the rocks all day. At dusk the youngest started out, and in 3 hours he returned with a friend who carried a stout cane. They tried to put the professor through his routine then and there, but the man from Foggera was in a hurry to get back to town, so they all set out on the Mihara. In the town they went directly to the villager's home, where they had coffee in the courtyard sitting among the camels. Here the professor went into his act again, and this time there was prolonged merriment and much rubbing together of hands. An agreement was reached, a sum of money paid, and the Reguabat withdrew, leaving the professor in the house of the man with the cane, who did not delay in locking him into a tiny enclosure off the courtyard. The next day was an important one in the professor's life, for it was then that pain began to stir again in his being. A group of men came to the house, among whom was a venerable gentleman, better clothed than those others who spent their time flattering him, setting fervent kisses upon his hands and the edges of his garments. This person made a point of going into classical Arabic from time to time, to impress the others, who had not learned a word of the Quran. Thus his conversation would run more or less as follows, perhaps ad insula. The French there are stupid. Celestial vengeance is approaching. Let us not hasten it. Praise the highest and cast thine anathema against idols. With paint on his face. In case the police wished to look close. The others listened and agreed, nodding their heads slowly and solemnly. And the professor in his stall beside them listened, too. That is, he was conscious of the sound of the old man's Arabic. The words penetrated for the first time in many months. Noises, then, celestial vengeance is approaching. Then, it is an honor. 50 francs is enough. Keep your money. Good. And the Kawaji squatting near him at the edge of the precipice. Then, anathema against idols, and more gibberish. He turned over panting on the sand and forgot about it. But the pain had begun. It operated in a kind of delirium, because he had begun to enter into consciousness again. When the man opened the door and prodded him with his cane, he cried out in a rage, and everyone laughed. They got him on to his feet, but he would not dance. He stood before them, staring at the ground, stubbornly refusing to move. The owner was furious, and so annoyed by the laughter of the others that he felt obliged to send them away, saying that he would await a more propitious time for exhibiting his property, because he dared not show his anger before the elder. However, when they had left he dealt the professor a violent blow on the shoulder with his cane, called him various obscene things, and went out into the street, slamming the gate behind him. He walked straight to the street of the Owled Nail, because he was sure of finding the Reguabat there among the girls, spending the money. And there in a tent he found one of them still abed, while an owled nail washed the tea glasses. He walked in and almost decapitated the man before the latter had even attempted to sit up. Then he threw his razor on the bed and ran out. The owled nail saw the blood, screamed, ran out of her tent into the next, and soon emerged from that with 4 girls who rushed together into the coffeehouse and told the Kawaji who had killed the Regiba. It was only a matter of an hour before the French military police had caught him at a friend's house, and dragged him off to the barracks. That night the professor had nothing to eat, and the next afternoon, in the slow sharpening of his consciousness caused by increasing hunger, he walked aimlessly about the courtyard and the rooms that gave onto it. There was no one. In one room a calendar hung on the wall. The professor watched nervously, like a dog watching a fly in front of its nose. On the white paper were black objects that made sounds in his head. He heard them: Grande Epicuri du Sable. Juin. Lundi, Mardi, Mercredi. The tiny ink marks of which a symphony consists may have been made long ago, but when they are fulfilled in sound they become imminent and mighty. So a kind of music of feeling began to play in the professor's head, increasing in volume as he looked at the mud wall, and he had the feeling that he was performing what had been written for him long ago. He felt like weeping, he felt like roaring through the little house, upsetting and smashing the few breakable objects. His emotion got no further than this one overwhelming desire. So, bellowing as loud as he could, he attacked the house and its belongings. Then he attacked the door into the street, which resisted for a while and finally broke. He climbed through the opening made by the boards he had ripped apart, and still bellowing and shaking his arms in the air to make as loud a jangling as possible, he began to gallop along the quiet street toward the gateway of the town. A few people looked at him with great curiosity. As he passed the garage, the last building before the high mud archway that framed the desert beyond, a French soldier saw him. "Teens," he said to himself, "a holy maniac." Again it was sunset time. The professor ran beneath the arched gate, turned his face toward the red sky, and began to trot along the Piste d'Insula, straight into the setting sun. Behind him, from the garage, the soldier took a pot shot at him for good luck. The bullet whistled dangerously near the professor's head, and his yelling rose into an indignant lament as he waved his arms more wildly, and hopped high into the air at every few steps, in an access of terror. The soldier watched a while, smiling, as the cavorting figure grew smaller in the oncoming evening darkness, and the rattling of the tin became a part of the great silence out there beyond the gate. The wall of the garage as he leaned against it still gave forth heat, left there by the sun, but even then the lunar chill was growing in the air.